Hi everyone, and welcome to Alliance Live, the online information and learning portal showcasing examples of innovation and integrated working taking place across Scotland within health and social care. We continue the series of these 30-minute webinars and mark International Human Rights Day by looking at the what, why and how of human rights budget work, exploring the processes of budgeting, budget scrutiny and the added value of taking a human rights-based approach to this work and why now for Scotland. The Alliance Live webinar is presented by Alison Hosey. Alison has been the Research Officer at the Scottish Human Rights Commission since it commenced work in 2008. She supports the Commission's research needs by developing and managing external research contracts and undertaking primary and secondary research. Her current areas of work focus on human rights budget work, measurement of national progress on human rights, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, as our speaker deliver their presentation, we invite the audience to pose questions using the chat box, which is found within the toolbar at the bottom or top of your screen. These will make up the questions for the Q&A session, which will follow on the presentation and bring our webinar to a close. Now, without further delay, over to Alison.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a few words. This is a really interesting topic I've been working on now for the last couple of years, and trying to do it justice in half an hour is going to be a real challenge, but I will do my best. And we have a lot of resources available on our website for anybody who wants to look in more detail at some of the work that we've been doing. But just to start off then, more than a plan, the budget is the blueprint for how a government expresses its policy priorities and translates those policy priorities into its spending allocations. It reveals how much money a government intends to raise, from whom, and how those resources are going to be allocated and spent. And it's probably the most important policy tool prepared by any government for managing the economy and to express what it values. However, historically, we've had budgets in one corner and human rights in the other corner, and there hasn't really been a lot of discussion between them. And despite extensive work on equality and participatory budgeting in recent years, and a commitment from the Scottish Government back in 2014 to explore human rights considerations of future budgets, the Scottish budget remains one that's not grounded in its existing human rights obligations. And the government itself has said that its budget is a key sign of government values. But others have noted that if a budget is a sign of what a government values and human rights are not in there, then what they are saying effectively is that human rights are not a value worth counting. So why are human rights relevant to the budget? Well, all governments must respect, protect and fulfil human rights. And the way that they generate, allocate and spend money plays a key role in this. You can't guarantee the right to vote if you don't have an effective electoral system, just as you can't have access to justice or a fair trial without a well-funded judiciary. And you can't guarantee the right to habitable, accessible, affordable and secure housing without well-regulated public and private housing sectors. Understanding how a government manages public money also helps us to sort the rhetoric from the reality about the commitments to rights. And if the government has an obligation to do something specific, then it must be reflected in the budget. It's not just something nice to consider. But with all the different types of budgeting, people often ask, why do human rights budgeting? What would be the value or the added value to the political and social processes of Scotland by pursuing human rights budgeting? For me, the answer to that is firstly that if a government takes human rights standards into account when it's developing the budget, it brings effective, transparent, fair and accountable use of national resources. The added value here is that the budget is developed and implemented in line with human rights treaties that bind all future governments, regardless of who's in power. And human rights budget work helps us to progressively realise human rights. Good rights laws and policies can also still result in unacceptable experiences for rights holders if they're not properly resourced. So taking human rights standards into account when we develop the budgets isn't a magic bullet, but it can help us to ask the right questions to support effective, transparent, fair and accountable use of resources. So human rights budget work also allows us to question who takes part in decision making and how different social groups are affected by the budget. It means that appropriate priority must also be allocated to critical areas like health, education, access to justice, housing and work. It also means focusing not only on who has access to services, but on continually enhancing the availability, accessibility, affordability, and quality of those goods and services. Human rights, in this sense, provides a lever for more people-focused economic policy. Human rights budget work, if you think about it, it's about two different processes, really. Human rights budgeting, which is where we use the standards to shape the goals of the budget, and human rights principles to shape the process of budgeting in all its phases. And human rights budget analysis or scrutiny is where we analyse the public budget to assess the government's compliance with its human rights obligations, all with the goal of making public budgets more effective and helping to realise human rights and impact on people. It also allows us to monitor the budget process. How is the budget designed? Was it participative? Were decisions fair and transparent? And can the government be held to account for their decisions? And also monitoring revenue generation, allocation and spend, and tying that into impact about budgetary decisions through a human rights lens. The principles that we're talking about here, these ensure that the budget process and decisions are transparent and accountable. Decisions taken must also be done without discrimination and with the meaningful and active participation of rights holders. When we talk about the standards, by signing up to human rights treaties, governments are obliged to respect, protect and fulfil human rights. And this means that they mustn't interfere with the enjoyment of your rights. They've got to prevent violations of rights by third parties, and they've got to proactively take measures to fulfill, and that facilitating access to goods and services, promoting rights and how to claim them, and providing goods and services to people for whatever reasons beyond their control are unable to attain them. And it's these steps that you need to take into account many things, but one of them is the budgetary issue. And governments often use a lack of resources as to why certain rights are not being realised. And we need to interrogate that. You need to ask questions. Are they using their existing resources effectively without discrimination? Are their decision-making processes clear and transparent and participatory? Are their efforts to generate additional resources adequate and equitable? And my favourite way of thinking about this involves cake, as many things in life are good with cake. Instead of just saying, you know, here is your cake, and you fight over who gets which slice and who deserves the biggest bit or whether they deserve any cake at all. It's about first asking, is the cake as big as it could be? Is our taxation effective and fair? Have we done everything we can to crack down on tax evasion, tax avoidance and debt, which takes an estimated £3.5 to almost £8 billion a year away from the Scottish public purse? These are the steps that you've got to take to maximise available resources. And in doing that maximisation, we have to ensure that we deliver a minimum core of each right. And this is regardless of any country's given level of economic development. This is the red line below which a state can't fall. And failure to provide this minimum core means that the state is presumed by the UN to be in violation of a covenant or treaty. And unless it can demonstrate that every effort has been made to use all of its resources at its disposal to prioritise reaching that minimum level. We've also got to be progressively realising people's rights. So in other words, that minimum core I just mentioned is not a ceiling of achievement, but it's a basic floor. So governments are expected to make continual progress on what they deliver as effectively and efficiently as possible towards the full realisation of rights. Governments also mustn't take backward steps. If a state does take a retrogressive step, it must fully justify that option. And it must be a temporary measure. It must be necessary and proportionate. It mustn't be discriminatory, so it mustn't have discriminatory or disproportionate impacts on different groups. You must still protect that minimum core, and all other options, other financial options, must be have been looked at. So we must be looking at whether or not money could be raised in other ways before we make cuts. And this all must be done to reduce inequality as soon as possible. But on its own, through human rights budgeting is not sufficient for realising rights. It's got to be part of a larger process. And before the development of the budget comes the development of laws, policies and plans that are also shaped by human rights standards. The budget is then created to directly realise these plans. The Scottish Government in recent years has made a number of commitments to further human rights protections, including economic, social and cultural rights. However, for us to now move beyond the rhetoric and to actually respect, protect and fulfil those rights, The government needs to develop its policy and then allocate, generate, and spend its money, all in a way that is grounded within the human rights framework. And this involves examining a country's international human rights obligations, looking at what rights and duties that they have, before then analysing the human rights concerns that face different groups within and across different social sectors. Then designing our laws, policies and plans that respond to those concerns, before allocating adequate budget to implement those policies. And then finally, monitoring whether the money has actually been spent as planned, looking at what was delivered and who it was delivered to, and then evaluating whether the policy was implemented and what impact it had. So that's the kind of the why and the what, and moving into a bit of a whistle-stop tour onto the how. Just for me, these are lots and lots of questions here. I'm not going to go through them all, but for me, doing human rights budget work, both in terms of budgeting and budget scrutiny, starts with asking the right questions. And the right questions based on principles and standards during when the budget's created and through budget cycle. And in relation to the budget process, these questions help us to assess whether or not it's been done transparently, participatorily, and whether it's accountable. They help us to identify if the government has raised all of the revenue it can from all possible sources, and whether it's allocated and spent money efficiently and fairly to ensure that minimal level of provision and the continual improvement of rights. The answer to these questions should be included in a full cycle of scrutiny that starts with policy goals and ends with their impacts and outcomes. And using human rights to connect the national budget to policy outcomes will help us identify whether or not that allocation and spend has indeed resulted in greater enjoyments of rights, whether funded programmes are discriminatory. And Scotland's National Performance Framework includes a set of national outcomes. The Budget Process Review Group in 2017 said it wanted to see better connections reflected within the national budget process, connecting outcomes with spend. So these are all asking the same questions. And the questions help us to raise red flags. It helps us to strengthen democratic debate about key policy decisions. And critically thinking about what human rights implications are of the different budget decisions in this way helps us to ground budget decisions in the experience of people, of rights holders. And this is a really important way of ensuring that human beings don't get lost in the technical process of budgeting and analysis. In order to ask those questions, it's also worth looking at identifying indicators, making comparisons, and analysing over time. For the indicators, there's a variety of different types that we can develop, both to look at the process and also to compare the money that's generated, allocated, and spent. When we make comparisons, it's looking at relative progression or regression. We can look at national or international targets, such as the UN treaties, national targets, such as the national outcomes, looking at other countries to compare ourselves, and not just comparing ourselves to see if we're slightly better than the rest of the UK, but looking to other countries that we aspire to that have more and better rights realisation than we do. Looking at other economic indicators, relevant indicators, and also crucially looking between groups. So for example, looking at equalities groups with protected characteristics to see whether or not people are benefiting or who is benefiting, because disparities at the local level can also help us raise red flags of possible discrimination in the distribution of centralised funds or decentralised funds. Analysing over time allows us to assess if governments are making a genuine effort to progressively realise rights, and it can also help support impact analysis connecting budgets to outcomes and showing whether allocations or what allocations have potentially been drivers for change. But often what really matters the most is what's actually spent. So if a government hasn't spent all of its allocated money, then it's not made full maximum available use of its maximum available resources. So we need to ask as well, has the government spent what it said it was going to do during the course of the year? Has it spent it on what it said it was going to spend it on? And if allocated funds haven't been spent, how have they been reallocated? And was that process of reallocation done in a transparent, participative and accountable way? And then perhaps most importantly for analysis over time is remembering to ask, are we talking about cash terms or real terms? Because inflation here is really important. When you look at the budget and you look over time, quite often it will tell you on a year-to-year basis whether there's been any change. And from a year-to-year basis, you might have a policy that's had money allocated to it, and it says no change, no change, no change. And over a 5-year period, it said no change every year. But over a 5-year period, that's potentially about 8% decrease in actual funds. So you need to look at the rate of inflation and ask the questions, particularly when politicians are talking about money and money that they're putting onto policy. Are they talking about cash terms or real terms? So that, in a sense, is a whistle-stop tour of the what, why, and how. On the screen right now, we have a range of the different resources that you can access either via the Commission or other resources, global resources that are really useful in reading and finding out a bit more about human rights budgeting. I'm also more than happy for people to contact the Commission, to contact me if they want to find out more about the work that we are doing currently on this area.
That's great. Thank you, Alison. That brings us to the end of the presentation section and onto the Q&A portion of the webinar. So just remember, if you've got any further questions as Alison is answering the ones that we've got so far, then just please feel free to post them and we'll begin posing them. So the first one up that we have is, how does Scotland's record in human rights budgeting compare to other countries?
It's an interesting question. We haven't specifically looked at comparing what other systems exist, mainly because a lot of other countries are not also doing this work. So I think we're not any worse than other areas, but we're not any better. Scotland has a good track record on trying to embed equality budgeting processes with the support of the Equality Budget Advisory Group. We have been producing an equality statement on the budget for the last 10 years. So there is a history there, but a history that needs to be built on because it doesn't go far enough and it doesn't look at our right standards. But we are, in doing this work and starting to do this work, I think, a bit ahead of the game. We have an opportunity in Scotland, the government has an opportunity right now to really take a lead in this field.
And can you point to a specific example where Scotland has used human rights budgeting successfully?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say that the Scottish Government doesn't use, it doesn't do human rights budgeting. I think we are starting at the moment to develop, when we went, the way the whole project started, we had some funding from the EU to look at doing some budget scrutiny. And the problem was when we actually get into it, it was really difficult to do because the budget as it is set is really difficult to break into. It's quite opaque. It's not very transparent. It's not easy to follow the money. So our first stop was to actually develop some indicators on to help create a better process to try and encourage better transparency so that we will be able to do that budgeting in future. But at the moment, we don't do it from that perspective. Okay.
And so this is the final question we've got, but please continue if you've got any others that you'd like to ask before we close here. So it's, how can citizens or organisations advocating on their behalf scrutinise the Scottish Government from this human rights budgeting approach?
We've got a really good dissemination series of sort of briefing papers that look at lots of different aspects of how you can start to do this work. The budget process in Scotland, in terms of being able to access it, it is a good system. It needs a lot of improvement, and the committees, particularly the Scottish parliamentary committees, are working on improving the access that the general public has to be able to support budget scrutiny across the board. There is move from just scrutinising the period just directly after the budget is released to now it being a year-long process, and all of the parliamentary committees throughout the year take part in pre-budget scrutiny. And anyone can participate within that. Each of the committees will put out calls during the year, either on inquiries on a specific subject or at the pre-budget scrutiny stage during the summer, and people can participate in that. We've got a lot of guidance about how they can make best use of doing, taking part in that process. But that's a key area where people can really start to ask the right questions of the government, and again, using the resources that we've got to help ask those questions from a rights perspective.
And so we've had two more questions come in, actually. The first one is from Ebony Bamber. Is human rights budgeting as an approach to an extent a development of participatory budgeting models which started in Brazil?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll fly through. I had a few slides. Just here's the one when I thought this question might come up. People often ask, human rights budgeting, how different is it from participatory budgeting or gender budgeting or equality budgeting? And this schematic that was put together by the Centre for Economic and Social Rights, it sets out the different types of budgeting that can be done. And whether you're focusing on process or content, or decisions or analysis, the point that we would make is that they're all about articulating demands for action to improve the situation on the ground for different people, using the budget as the tool to do that. And with a common goal, questioning whose voices are heard in and how different groups are affected by a government's budgetary decisions with reference to an agreed upon standard. And I guess this is where, participatory budgeting, human rights budgeting is and should be participatory. What we found in looking at what the difference between human rights budgeting or where it adds the value is that it provides that agreed upon standard that participatory budgeting can be or can have as its focus. That framework is the human rights framework.
And so I think we've got the one final question. Anne-Marie Ward says, I'm particularly concerned with budgets for alcohol and drug treatment. Are the current budgets in line with human rights budgeting?
The current budgets are not done from a rights-based perspective. For whichever particular issues, we don't use that as a starting point. What we should be doing is looking at what our commitments are, and particularly in the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Within there are obligations about what governments should be doing, and there's a lot of international advice about what that should look like in terms of budgeting. That would allow governments to be able to look at the marginalised groups, people most in need, and where money should be being spent. That would be the gold standard, and that's not what's happening at the moment.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you to Alison for delivering the fantastic presentation and answering those questions. We hope it has provided some insight and takeaways to bring to your own organisations. Before we go, we'd like to draw your attention to the contact details for Alliance Live. Should you be interested in holding your own Alliance Live activity, so you can reach us on via Twitter at Alliance Scot or using the hashtag Alliance Live. You can also email us live@alliance-scotland.org.uk or call us on 0141 404 0231. So finally, a big thank you to everyone again who registered for this webinar. This has been our final one for 2019. We're looking forward to engaging with you all again in January with a new programme of activity. And please keep an eye out for further announcements on this through the Alliance Twitter. Thank you very much.